Hey, I'm Max and welcome to my Unity Basics video about GameObjects and transforms. So what is a GameObject in Unity? It's simply an object in your game. Thanks for watching, make sure to subscribe. No, I'm just kidding. So a GameObject is technically just an object in your game, but I'm going to explain what that means obviously. So let's say I create an empty GameObject. So I just right click here and create empty. What is this GameObject here? Well, technically it's nothing. A GameObject is just something that holds components. By default, a GameObject has a transform, which means a position, rotation, and scale, but that itself doesn't do anything if there's no component on it. So let's see here. Our GameObject is right here. We can use the move tool to move it around, and it moves the transform, but it doesn't show anything, it doesn't do anything. So a GameObject is made to hold components. So let's say we do a sprite renderer on it, which is made to render sprites obviously, and we select a sprite like the enemy. We set the order layer to 1 so it's above the other one, and there you go. Now our GameObject is a sprite render, or actually our GameObject contains a sprite renderer. So now a sprite selected here displays or renders, if you want to use the same word, at the location of the transform. So a transform is simply a position, rotation, and scale, and a GameObject is simply a list of components. To add a component, just click Add Component and add it, and to remove it, just click the little 3 dots at the end and click Remove. And if you click a different GameObject, you will see here in the inspector, it changes what component you see and the transform to the one of the GameObject you clicked. You can have GameObjects that are child to other GameObjects, and that means that the transform of the parents will affect all the childs. So let's say here I create a copy of my newly made GameObject with the sprite, and I set it as a child by dragging it under. If I then move it next to the other one, so now if I go on the child and I move it, it only moves the child, but if I go on the parent and move it, it moves both. Same thing for rotation and scale. If I rotate the parent, it rotates both. Also, if I delete the parent, it will also delete both. So the transform of a GameObject is affected by the transform of each parent. Also, one useful thing you can do with GameObjects is drag them into your assets in any sort of folder, and it will create a prefab. So let's say I drag the one we created here. You can see it creates a GameObject prefab, and the one in the scene turned blue, and that means it's a prefab. So here in the scene I can actually delete this one, and if I drag the prefab back in, you can see it creates the exact same copy with the exact same sprites, exact same angle, and even the child is copied. So now you might wonder, why is that useful? Well, first of all, if you want to create multiple copies, obviously you can always Control D or duplicate, right click duplicate, but you can also create a prefab, and if I change anything in the prefab, let's say I change the order layer to 2, and now I go on my scene, you can see the order layer of both changed to 2. Another reason prefabs can be useful is because you can put them in your scripts, and that means you can spawn an object with your script and keep all the components and parameters the same. So for example, here I have a prefab with my enemy, and if I drag it in, you'll see it's the right color, the right size, the right order and layer. It has the rigid body to move, it has the enemy script with the right speed, and the particles. So obviously in my script, if I want to spawn an enemy, I don't want to create a new GameObject and then add a sprite renderer and then set the sprite, set the order and layer, add a rigid body, set the drag, set the enemy script. You get the idea. So by making a prefab, I can just go in my script, create that prefab, and bam, everything is there. Now I haven't made the video about scripts yet, but let's still check how to use GameObjects in scripts, so when we learn how to use scripts, we can already use GameObjects in them. So the way you declare a variable for a GameObject is GameObject with a capital G and O. So let's say you want to use a prefab, you will do a public GameObject and then the name you want to use for your prefab. And over here in the inspector of your script, you simply want to take your prefab here and drag it in the field. So I can set any sort of GameObject here. You can see I can change them, and that's the one that will be spawned by the script. So here I set my enemy prefab, and then to create a GameObject, you use the instantiate method. So here, since I put the enemy prefab, it will create a GameObject that is a copy of the enemy prefab. But I could also create a new GameObject, and it would simply create an empty GameObject. When you create a GameObject, you also want to set the position right here and the rotation. So no rotation is just quaternaire.identity. Another thing you could do is set the parent instead of setting the position and the rotation. So if, for example, I did transform here, it would create the enemy as a child of the game, so it's spawned under here, just like this. In my case though, I don't want the enemy to be a child of anything, so I just put the position and rotation, and that way it's going to spawn in the scene with no parent like this. If you want to edit the prefab or the empty game object you created, you can also take as a variable the object created. So now when we instantiate the game object, it's going to store in this variable the object that was created. So then I can take the variable and get all the GameObjects components. Let's quickly go over some useful scripts GameObjects method. A very useful method to find the game object that you want is to use the findObjectOfType method. So let's say I want to find my player because I want to get the player speed or whatever. So I'll do player equals to findObjectOfType and then player, and now that will find the first player it can find. If it cannot find any, it will return null. You can also do objects with an S, and here you have to put an array so it can put all the players in here, and then you can loop through that array to find all the players. Once you have your game object, you can get all the components on it by doing .getComponent and then the type of component you want to find. So let's say sprite renderer, and that will find my sprite renderer on my object. So here, for example, I could do .sprite and then equals and then set another sprite, and here in my enemy that will be created will have the sprite that I set here. You can also access the transform by doing the GameObject.transform and then let's say .position equals new vector, and you can change the position that way. You can also use getComponent in children to find a component in a children or in a parent, and just like the object, you can put an S and an array and find all the components in children or in parent. So let's say here I do transform.position equals new vector 3 0 0 0, and now if I save and run this, every enemy that spawns should have the transform position 0 0 0, and as you can see it spawned at 0 0 0, and the next one as well. If you put something like, let's say, public sprite renderer and whatever you want to call it, and you want to get the game object that sprite renderer is attached to, you can do sprite renderer.GameObject, and that will return to you the game object that the component is attached to. Another useful method for game objects is called destroy with a capital D, and inside here you put any sort of game object. And just like I said, if you have something else than a game object, let's say sprite renderer for your enemy, and you want to destroy the enemy, just do .GameObject. But here I already have a game object, so it's okay. And as the name suggests, this will destroy the game object. So in this case I can't really show you because it will destroy as soon as it spawns. But you saw earlier that they were spawning and now they're not spawning anymore. Well, technically they are, but they're getting deleted instantly. While I was editing that video, I realized I forgot to say something very important. So if you select a game object, you can click the little check mark next to the name, and that will disable it or enable it. So here if I go on my knight, I can disable it and enable it. When you disable the game object, it disables all the components as well. So in this case the sprite will no longer render, it will no longer animate, and if there was any script on it, it wouldn't be effective anymore. You can also disable and enable in script, and you can also check if a game object is enabled or not. So the way you check if a game object is enabled in script is to do .ActiveSelf, and that's going to return true if it's active and false if it's not active. You can also set it with setActive and then true or false. So for example, in this case, every time I spawn an enemy, I set it active to false, so it's going to spawn inactive. And as you can see, it's working. My enemies are spawning inactive, and that means they don't move, they don't appear, they don't do anything in the script. And if I activate them, then they start moving and showing again. So that's it for basics of game objects and transforms. You just have to see game objects as kind of folders for components, and transforms as the position, rotation, and all that stuff of every game object. Other than that, setting child and parents can sometimes be useful for things that follow. For example, the player and the weapon in hand. You can put the weapon as a child of the player, so it follows the player. And creating prefabs can be pretty useful if you have an object that's kind of complex and you don't want to recreate it every single time. Hopefully that was clear. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Feel free to go watch my other Unity basics if you're just starting out with Unity and you want to learn all the basics to get started. And you can also check my full game tutorials to see how to make games from beginning to the end. I will create a playlist for my Unity basics, and also I created a playlist for every game tutorial that I did, and I guess I'll keep doing that in the future too. So depending on when you watch this video, there might be a ton of game tutorials ready for you to do from the start to finish. Make sure to subscribe for my next tutorials if you're interested. And never give up. I know you can do it. It's gonna take a little bit of time to learn, but it's worth it. I'm sure you're gonna have a lot of fun.